Hello and welcome to the course Blazor CRUD Jumpstart with Entity Framework Core in .NET 8. I'm Ganesh and I'll be your instructor for this course. So in this course we'll learn how to perform CRUD operations using Entity Framework Core in a Blazor web app in .NET 8. Through this course we'll be building a simple book catalog app that uses static server rendering for the most part, and we'll build a create page that lets us add a new book to the app, a list page that displays all the books, an edit page that lets us update the details of a single book, and finally for the delete operation, we'll implement a simple razor component that shows a confirmation dialog before deleting a book. Now since the application uses static server rendering, the delete button won't be interactive, so we'll be adding interactivity to the application on a per component basis. Along the way, we'll be learning other features of Blazor in .NET 8, such as enhanced navigation and form handling, and streaming rendering. This course is ideal for developers who have some experience with Blazor and Entity Framework Core and who want to learn how to perform CRUD operations using these two frameworks in .NET 8. So thank you, and I hope to see you on the other side. This course uses .NET version 8.0, which you can download from this URL here. And for development, I'll be using Visual Studio 2022 IDE, which you can download from this URL here. And during installation, make sure you have ASP.NET and Web Development workload checked, and under individual components, make sure you have SQL Server Express Local DB checked as well. In this video, we will learn how to create a database using Entity Framework Core in a Blazor web app in .NET 8. Let's start Visual Studio 2022. Click Create a New Project. From the All Project Types drop-down, select Other and select the Blank Solution template and click Next. Let's give the solution a name. Say Simple Book Catalog and click Create. Let's add a project for our domain layer. Right-click the solution in Solution Explorer and select Add New Project. In this drop-down here, select Library and select the Class Library template here and click Next. Let's give the project a name. Since this project represents our domain layer, let's name it simplebookcatalog.domain. So copy the solution name and paste it here and add the .domain suffix and click Next. Make sure .NET 8 is in the drop-down and click Create. We don't need the class1 class here, so let's right-click the class1.cs class file and click Delete. Let's create a folder inside this project for our book class. So right-click the project in Solution Explorer and select Add New Folder. Let's name the folder Entities. Right-click the Entities folder and select Add Class. Name the class Book and click the Add button. Let's remove these using statements here. Press Ctrl and click Remove Unnecessary Usings. Make the class public so that it can be accessed outside the project. A book needs to be uniquely identified, so let's create a public int property called ID. A book will also have a title, so let's create an nullable string property called title. Similarly, create a property for the author's name. Call it author. Then create a public nullable datetime property called publication date. Now a book belongs to a category, so let's define an enum for that. Right-click the project in Solution Explorer and select Add New Folder. Name the folder Enums. Now right-click the Enums folder and select Add Class. Name the class Category and click Add. Again, remove the using statements and mark the class public. Change the class to an enum. Let's define a few members such as Science, Technology, Fitness, Travel. Let's go back to the book class and define a public property of type category. Let's bring the namespace simplebookcatalog.domain.enums and call the property category. Click the Save All button. Our domain layer is now complete. Let's create a project for our application layer. Right-click the solution and select Add New Project. From Recent Project Templates, double-click the Class Library template. Let's name the project simplebookcatalog.application and click Next. We have .NET 8 in the drop-down, so let's click Create. In this application project, we want to define an interface for our repository. This repository interface needs to be able to access the book entity class in the domain layer. So let's add a project reference from the application project to the domain project. So right click the dependencies node and select add project reference and select simple book catalog.domain here and click OK. Let's delete the class1.cs class file. Right click the application layer project and select add new folder. Name the folder interfaces. Right click the interfaces folder and select add new item. Select interface from the list and name the interface iBook repository and click add. Let's remove these using statements and make the interface public. Let's click save all. Now that we have our repository interface in place, we need to implement the repository. This repository implementation will belong to the infrastructure layer. So let's go ahead and create a project for that. Right click the solution and select add new project. Double click the class library template. Let's name the project simple book catalog.infrastructure and click next. Again, we have .NET 8 here. Click create. The infrastructure project needs to use the repository interface that's defined in the application project. So let's add a project reference to the application project. Delete the class1.cs class file. Right click the infrastructure project and select add new folder. Name the folder repositories. Now right click the repositories folder and select add class. Name the class book repository and click add. Let's remove the using statements and mark the class public. Now this class needs to implement the iBook repository interface. So let's implement that. Bring in the namespace simple book catalog.application.interfaces. Now this repository class has to work with the data access API. Since we are going to use Entity Framework Core Object Relational Mapper as a data access API, we need to go ahead and install the NuGet package for that. In particular, we need to install the NuGet package for the database provider that we want to use. So in our case, we're going to use SQL Server Express Local DB. Let's install the appropriate NuGet package. So go to Tools, NuGet Package Manager and Package Manager console. Set the default project to Infrastructure and type in install-package microsoft.entityframeworkcore.sql server and press enter. In Entity Framework Core, we need to create what is known as a context class. So right click the project in Solution Explorer and select add new folder and name the folder context. Now right click the context folder and select add class. Name the class simple book catalog DB context and click add. Remove the using statements. Mark the class public. This class has to inherit from Entity Framework Core's DB Context API. So let's do that. Bring in the namespace Microsoft.entityframeworkcore. Now, in order to talk to the database, the DB Context class needs to know what database provider to use and the connection string information. So here we can declare a constructor into which we can inject DB context options of simple book catalog DB context and call it options and pass this information to the base class constructor. Now the job of the context class is to wrap the domain entities into a data model by exposing them as DB sets. So let's create a public property of type DB set of book. Bring in the namespace simple book catalog.domain.entities and call the property books. This books property will be mapped to a corresponding table named books once we create the database. Let's go to the book class. The different properties of the book class will be mapped to the corresponding columns in the books table. Now, by convention, the ID property will become the primary key, and since we have defined the title and author properties as being nullable, the corresponding title and author columns will be allowed to have null values. If we want to override these default conventions, we can use data annotations and Fluent API. Let's first see how to use data annotations. Data annotations are attributes that we can apply on model properties. So let's say, for example, the title column should have a mandatory value, so it should not allow nulls. So we can apply the attribute required, bring in the namespace system.componentModel.data annotations. Likewise, we can specify the maximum number of characters the column can hold by using the maxLength attribute and passing in a number. Let's copy the two attributes for the author property as well. Note that we can use string length instead of max length because it adds support for client-side validation as well. Another way to configure the model is to use the Fluent API. Note that we are not going to use Fluent API for our demo. We're going to stick to data annotations, but for the sake of completion, let me demonstrate how to use the Fluent API. So let's go to the simple book catalog DB context class, and here we can override the onModelCreating method. So say protected override and choose onModelCreating and remove the call to the base method. And inside this method, we can say modelBuilder.entity of book.property e goes to e.title.isRequired.hasMaxLength 100. We can copy this and paste it below and change title to author for enforcing this on author as well. Again, as I already said, we're not going to use Fluent API, so let's remove this method. Now that our context class is ready, we can use this context inside our repository. So go to the book repository class and define a constructor. Normally, we can inject the context class directly into the constructor, but since our presentation layer will be a Blazor web app with support for interactive server rendering, meaning we'll add support for Blazor server, we need to inject IDB context factory of simple book catalog DB context. Let's call it factory. Create a private read-only field of type simple book catalog DB context and call it context. And inside the constructor, initialize context to factory.createDB context. Since we are injecting IDB context factory into the constructor, we need to register the service in the startup project. So let's create a new project for our presentation layer. Right-click the solution in Solution Explorer and select Add New Project. From this drop-down here, select Blazor and select the Blazor web app template and click Next. Let's give the project a name of Simple Book Catalog and click Next. So here in the drop-down, we have .NET 8 selected. We have the authentication type set to None. Let's leave the interactive render mode set to Server. So this configures interactive server rendering using the Blazor server hosting model. And let's leave the interactivity location set to per page or component. So this means that the entire application will use static server rendering, but then interactivity can be enabled on a per component basis using interactive server. And let's leave this checkbox checked and click Create. Let's set this project as a startup project. So right-click the project and select Set as Startup Project. Now we want this project to reference the application and the infrastructure projects. So right-click the dependencies node and select Add Project Reference and select the application and infrastructure projects and click OK. Now open the program.cs class file and here let's register the services required for DB context factory. So say builder.services.addDBContextFactory and pass in simple book catalog DB context as a type argument. Bring in the namespace simple book catalog.infrastructure.context and pass in a lambda expression as a method argument. So say options goes to create a code block and inside that say options.useSQLServer. Bring in the namespace Microsoft.EntityFramework Core. We can pass in a connection string. Now instead of hardcoding a connection string, we can fetch it from a configuration file. So let's say builder.configuration.getConnectionString and pass in a string with the name of simple book catalog connection. Copy the string and open Solution Explorer and double-click appsettings.json file. Put a comma and define a connection strings section, and inside that paste the connection string name and give it a value of server equals localDB / MSSQL localDB semicolon database equals simple book catalog, semicolon, trusted underscore connection equals true. This is the connection string to use if we want to connect to SQL Server Express local DB. Now it's time to create the database. In order to do that, we can use Entity Framework Core migrations. So we need to do two things. We first need to create a migration and then apply that migration. So go to Tools, NuGet Package Manager console, and make sure the default project is set to the infrastructure project. Now, to use migrations, we need to install a set of tools. So for example, if we just go and say add-migration initial and hit enter, we see we get an error. So let's install the required tools. So say install-package microsoft.entityframeworkcore.tools. Now even after installing the tools, if we say add-migration initial, we see we get an error. This is because our startup project does not reference microsoft.entityframeworkcore.design. So let's change the default project to Simple Book Catalog, which is our startup project, and now install the package microsoft.entityframeworkcore.design. Now change the default project back to infrastructure and try creating migrations. It will succeed. So let's say add-migration initial. If we open Solution Explorer, in the infrastructure project, we can see a migrations folder, and if we expand that folder, we can see a class file that ends with initial.cs. That file is visible right here. We see it contains a method called up. This method contains instructions on what changes need to be made to the database when we apply that migration. So in this case, it will go ahead and create the books table. Similarly, it contains a down method that contains instructions on what changes need to be made to the database when we revert or undo a migration. So in this case, it will drop the books table. So the Entity Framework Core migrations feature lets us evolve the database schema as the model changes. Now go back to Package Manager console and apply the migration. Type update-database and hit enter. Let's check if the database got created. Go to View, SQL Server Object Explorer, expand SQL Server, expand the local DB instance, and then databases. We see we have a simple book catalog database. Expand that and expand the tables node. We have our books table. Now if you further expand that and the columns, we can see the various columns. These columns correspond to the properties of the book entity class. And as you may notice, the title and author columns have their maximum length up to 100 characters and have the not null definitions as well. So this is due to the data annotations that were applied to the properties on the book entity class. And if we right click the books table and select view data, we don't have any data to start with. So in the next video, we'll learn how to save data using Entity Framework Core in a Blazor web app in .NET 8. In this video, we are going to learn how to save data to a database using Entity Framework Core in a Blazor web app in .NET 8. And we'll use the edit form component in Blazor to accept input data. Let's add a method to the iBook repository interface for performing the create operation. So let's say task add async book, bring in the namespace simplebookcatalog.domain.entities and call the parameter book. Let's implement this method in the infrastructure project. So go to the infrastructure project and open the book repository class and implement the interface. Now say context.books.add book and await. Notice we have the async modifier added here. Context.saveChanges async. Now let's work on the presentation layer. So go to the Simple Book Catalog project and expand the components folder. First, let's make some changes to the main layout component. So expand the layout folder and double click main layout.razor. Now remove the sidebar div with its navigation menu and also remove the top row div. And let's set only the padding top for this article here. So set it to PT5. And since we are not using the nav menu component, let's go ahead and delete that component. And expand the pages folder and delete all the components inside that folder. Now let's add a new Razor component which will contain a form to add a new book. Right-click the Pages folder and select Add Razor Component. Name the component Add New and click Add. We want this component to be a routable component so that it can be accessed via a URL. So let's set the page directive at the top. So say @page/add-new. Now if we run the application and navigate to /add-new, we can see the add new heading that was present on our component. We don't need the heading, so let's remove it. Now let's set the text that's displayed on the title bar of the browser window or the browser tab by using the page title component. So say add new book. In the code block, let's define a public property of type book. This book entity is present in the domain layer. So let's bring in the namespace simplebookcatalog.domain.entities. Normally, we wouldn't want to reference the domain entities directly in the presentation project. Rather, we want to use a view model. But for this demo, I'll stick with the domain entity. Let's put the using directive in the imports.razor file so that we don't have to import it in every Razor component. Going back to the add new component, let's call the property book and instantiate it as well. Now let's create our form. Here, create a div with the bootstrap class row and justify content center, and inside that create a div with the class call6. Let's use the edit form component to create our form. Set method equals post because this form will post to the server. Every form needs to have a name, so set the form name parameter to add book form and set the model parameter to the book property we just created. And lastly, turn off autocompletion for the form by setting autocomplete equals off. Now inside the edit form component, create a heading with the text add new book. Then create a div with some margin bottom. So say div class equals mb3. Define a label element with for set to title and class form label. The text of that label should be title. And then let's use the input text component with id set to title and use a bind-value Razor directive attribute, setting it to book.title, and set the class attribute to form control and shadow none. Copy the entire div and paste it below 3 times. Now for the second label element, let's set the for attribute to author and set the label text to author, and also set the id attribute of the input text to author and bind value Razor directive attribute to book.author. For the next label, set the for attribute to publication date and set the text to date published. Now instead of input text, let's use input date. So change input text to input date and set its id attribute to publication date and set bind value to book.publication date. Now inside this div, let's remove the input text component because we want to use input select. Set the for attribute of the label to category and set the label text to category. And below, let's use the input select component and set its id attribute to category. Set bind value to book.category. And finally set the class attribute to form control shadow none. Now let's set a default option for this input select component. So inside the input select component, define an option element with value set to 0 and set the content to select category. Next, we want to loop through each member of the category enum. So let's use the for each loop. Say @for each var category in enum.getValues and pass in type of category. Now this category is present in simplebookcatalog.domain.enums namespace. So let's bring that namespace in. Now we can put that using directive in imports.razor file. Now go back to the add new component and inside the for each loop, define an option element with its value set to @category and set its content to @category.toString. Finally, we'll create a div with a class MB3, and inside that, let's define a button element with its text set to submit and class set to btn, btn primary, shadow none. Following this div, let's use the data annotations validator component, which enables form validation. And lastly, use the validation summary component to display a list of all errors. Now when the button is clicked, the form will post to the server. So let's use the onValidSubmit parameter of the edit form component and set it to add book. Down in the code block, create a private async method that returns a task and call it add book. Now inside the add book method, we want to be able to access the form data. So let's set the supply parameter from form attribute on the book property. Now once we do this, the book property will be supplied from form data, and then we can use the book property inside the add book method. Now we want to save the book, and we already have a repository for that. So inject iBook repository, bring in the namespace simple book catalog.application.interfaces and call it repository. Put the using directive in inputs.razor file and go back to the add new component. Also, once we perform the create operation, we want to redirect the user to a new page. For that, we need to use navigation manager. So let's inject navigation manager, call it navigation, then scroll down and inside the add book method, say await repository.addAsync and pass in book, then navigation.navigate to. Let's pass in a slash to go to the root of the app. And since we are injecting iBook repository, we need to register the book repository service. So open Solution Explorer, go to program.cs, and here say builder.services.addScoped, and for the type arguments, pass in iBook repository, bring in the namespace, comma, book repository, and bring in the namespace for that as well. Now let's run the app. First, let's demonstrate an important feature of Blazor in .NET 8 called static server rendering. Right-click the page and click Inspect and go to the Network tab and navigate to /add-new. We can see that the component and all other assets got rendered from the server. So this is called static server rendering. So we have our form with all the elements, but there's an issue with the select list here. We have signs as a default option. Rather, we want select category as a default option. We'll fix that in a bit. Let's submit the form without entering any data. Click the submit button. We see a list of all the validation errors with their default error messages. Now go back to Visual Studio and go to the add new component. For this input select component, we have the select category options value set to 0. But if we go to the domain project and expand the enums folder and open the category enum, we see by default the enum members have their values starting from 0. That's why we see signs as a default option selected. So let's set signs to 1 and expand the entities folder and go to the book class, decorate the category property with the enum data type attribute, pass in type of category, and set the error message to please select a category. So when the user does not select a category, this error message will be displayed. Likewise, let's set an error message for the title property when a value is not supplied. In the required attribute, pass in error message equals please provide a title. And for the author property, let's set the error message to please provide the author's name. Now let's run the app and navigate to /add-new. We can see our form and we have select category as a default option. And if we click the submit button, we see our custom error messages. Now let's demonstrate another feature of Blazor in .NET 8 called enhanced form handling. Right-click the page and click inspect and click the network tab and clear the network trace and reload the page. Once again, we see all the assets getting downloaded from the server. Now watch the loading spinner here once I click the submit button. We can see a small blip And on the right hand side here, all the assets got downloaded from the server once again. So this means that we're not taking advantage of enhanced form handling. By default, enhanced form handling is disabled. So let's go back to Visual Studio and enable enhanced form handling by setting the enhanced parameter of the edit form component to true. Now run the app, right click the page, click inspect and click the network tab and navigate to the add new component. And once again look at the loading spinner when I click the submit button. We see there is no blip occurring this time. So here on the right hand side, we can see that instead of returning all the assets from the server, a fetch request was made by blazor.web.js for the add new component, and only that component was rendered and the UI was updated. Finally, let's test our form. Enter some data and click the submit button. If we wait for a while, it will navigate to the root URL, and since we don't have a page for that endpoint, we get an error 404 response. Let's go back to Visual Studio and go to View, SQL Server Object Explorer and open the simple book catalog database and right click the books table and say View Data. We see that a record got inserted into the database. In the next video, we'll learn how to read data from a database using Entity Framework Core in a Blazor web app in .NET 8. In this video, we're going to see how to read data from a database using Entity Framework Core in a Blazor web app in .NET 8. Let's add a method to the application project for performing the read operation. So in the application project, expand the interfaces folder and double-click iBook repository. Let's add a member, task of list of book, get all async. Now let's implement this method in the infrastructure project. So inside the infrastructure project, expand the repositories folder and double-click the book repository class. Let's implement this interface. And inside the method, say var books equals await context.books.toListAsync and return books. Now let's move on to the presentation layer. In the simple book catalog Blazor web app project, expand the components folder and expand the pages folder and double click add new.razor. Now we want to add a link to a page where we show a list of all books. So right below the submit button, let's add an anchor element with the text back to list. Set the href attribute to / and class attribute to btn secondary, shadow none. And we would like to add some margin. So say ms3. So now let's create the list component. So right click the pages folder and say add razor component and call the component list. Now we want this component to be a routable component. So add a page directive to the top, say at page and specify a route template of /. Now before we proceed any further, I want to demonstrate a feature of Blazor in .NET 8 called enhanced navigation. So let's run the app. And as you can see here, at the root URL, we have the list component rendered. Now right click the page and click inspect and click the network tab and navigate to the add new component. So here at the bottom, we have the back to list button. Now watch the loading spinner when I click the back to list button. We see that there is no blip. And on the right hand side here, we have a fetch request initiated by blazor.web.js for the list component. So instead of downloading all the assets from the server, we made a request only for the component we needed, and that component was rendered and the page was not reloaded. So this improves the user experience for the application. So this means that enhanced navigation is by default enabled. But if we want to turn off enhanced navigation, we can do that too. So go back to Visual Studio and go to the add new component. And to the anchor element, let's add an attribute data enhanced nav equals false. Now run the app once again. Right click the page, click inspect and click the network tab and navigate to the add new component. Once again watch the loading spinner when I click the back to list button. We see this time there's a blip, and on the right hand side here we see all the assets got downloaded from the server instead of making a request only for the component we needed. So this means that a page reload was going on since we turned off enhanced navigation for the link. Let's turn it back on. From the anchor element, remove the data enhanced nav attribute. Now let's work on the list component. So open list.razor and here remove the heading and use the page title component to set the title for the page which will be displayed in the browser tab. Let's set the text to book list. And in the code block, create a private nullable field of type list of book and call it books. And we want to get the list of books from the repository. So at the top here, say @inject iBook repository and call it repository. We want to get the list of all books once the component has been initialized. So we have a lifecycle method for that. So in the code block here, say protected override and choose on initialized async. And inside this method, say books equals await repository.getAllAsync. Notice we got the async modifier added to the method. Now let's add some Razor markup for displaying these books. So at the top here, create a div with the class row justify content center, and inside that create a div with the class call6. Now first let's check if books is null. So if books is null, create a div with the class book item, and inside that say loading books, please wait. Otherwise we want to check if the books variable contains any books. So say else if books.any. Let's use a for each loop to loop through the books and create a div with the class book item, and inside that let's create a div with the class book card and another div with the class book card body, and create a h5 heading and set the content to a Razor expression. So say @book.title, and after the heading say by @book.author, and let's use a vertical bar @book.publication date. Since the publication date is nullable, let's use a question mark .toString, and we want to display the date in the format month, day, year. So let's specify the format string. And finally, if there are no books to be found, say div class equals book item and set the content to no books found. Now if we run the app, we can see the single book that we added in the last video. Of course, the UI does not look good. We'll fix that in just a bit. But for now, I'm going to bring Visual Studio and the browser side by side. And I want to create a link in the list component to navigate to the add new component. So up here, create an anchor tag with the text add new and set the href attribute to add-new and set the class attribute to btn primary, shadow none, and let's add some margin at the bottom. So say MB3. Now if we want to see the page getting updated instantly, click on the drop down arrow next to the hot reload button and make sure hot reload on file save is checked. Otherwise click on it to check it and click the save button, and we see the add new button on the right hand side. Now let's add some books to the catalog by clicking on the add new button. Now it's time to style the UI. So open Solution Explorer and right click the Pages folder and select Add New Item. In the search bar, search for CSS and click Style Sheet and name the file list.razor.css. Now in the list component, we have a div with the class book item and we would like to style that. So inside the CSS file, say .book-item, open and close curly braces, set padding to 1.5 rem and click the save button to see the changes. Similarly, set margin bottom to 1 rem, set box shadow to 0, 0, 0.5 rem and specify the color RGBA 0, 0, 0, 0.3. And finally, let's add some border radius. Set border radius to 0.5 rem. Now that we have fixed our UI, let's talk about a couple of things. Go to list.razor and scroll down. We have this div with a class book card that displays the details of a single book. This is a good candidate for a reusable component. So copy this markup here and open Solution Explorer and right click the components folder and select Add Razor Component and name the component bookcard.razor. Now replace the heading with the copied markup. So paste it here and inside the code block, create a public property of type book. We need to make it required. Let's turn this property into a parameter so that its value can be supplied from the parent component. So decorate the property with the parameter attribute. Now in this markup here, we see squiggly lines. So replace book with the book property. Now go back to the list component. And instead of this markup here, say book card and set the book parameter to book. And now let's run the application. We see that the app works just fine. Finally, let's talk about another feature of Blazor in .NET 8 called streaming rendering. Let's go back to Visual Studio and in the list component, scroll down and here we are getting book information from SQL Server Express LocalDB database. This does not take much time, but let's say the data is present on a separate database server and there is some delay involved in getting the data. Let's simulate that kind of delay for our application by using await task.delay 3000. So basically we are waiting for 3000 milliseconds or 3 seconds before getting the data. So while it is taking some time to get the data that is simulated by this task.delay call, the books variable will be null. And if we scroll up, we can see we are checking if books is null, in which case we are displaying loading books, please wait message. Let's run the app. We can see we are getting the loading spinner here in the browser. And once the 3 seconds have elapsed, we are getting all the book data. However, we are not seeing the loading books message. This is happening because only after the book data is retrieved from the database, the page will be rendered and sent to the client browser. Till then, the page will still be loading and we won't see anything. So this definitely harms the user experience for our application. Let's turn on streaming rendering, go back to the list component and say @attribute stream rendering. Now let's run the app. As you can see, we have the initial UI displayed. In the meantime, data is being fetched from the database, and once data is available, that data will be streamed into the response and displayed in the UI. We don't need streaming rendering for our simple application, so let's remove this attribute and remove the task.delay call as well. In the next video, we'll learn how to update data using Entity Framework Core in a Blazor web app in .NET 8. In this video, we'll learn how to update data in a database using Entity Framework Core in a Blazor web app in .NET 8. And we'll use the edit form component in Blazor to accept input data. Let's add a method to the iBook repository interface to get a book by ID so that we can then update that book. So in the application project, expand the interfaces folder and double click iBook repository and say task of book, make it nullable, get by ID async, int ID. Also let's add a method to update that book. So say task update async book book. Let's implement these two methods in the infrastructure project. So in the infrastructure project, expand repositories and double click the book repository class. Let's implement the interface. And inside getById async method, say var book equals await context dot books dot first dot default async. E goes to e dot id equals id. Then let's return that book. And inside update async method, say context.entry book.state equals entity state.modified. And then await context.save changes async. Let's work on the presentation layer. In the simple book catalog project, open the book card component, and after the div with the class book card body, define a div with the class actions, and inside that, define an anchor element with the text edit, and for the href attribute value, we need to get the ID of the current book. So let's use a razor expression. So say at open and close parentheses. Since we want to pass in a string along with a dynamic value, let's use string interpolation. Say dollar within double quotes slash edit slash within curly braces book.id. And finally, set the class attribute to btn warning, shadow none. Now let's style this book card div so that there is some space between the book card body div and the actions div. So right click the components folder and select add new item and search for CSS and click style sheet and name the file bookcard.razor.css. So let's use the class selector. Say .book-card within curly braces display flex direction row justify content space between. Let's run the app. We can see the list of books along with their corresponding edit buttons. Let's try clicking one of them. We can see it takes us to a URL /edit/3. The value 3 is the ID of the third book we are editing. Since we don't have a page for this endpoint, we get a 404 not found error. So now let's implement the edit page. So go back to Visual Studio and right click the pages folder and select add razor component and name the component edit and click add. At the top here, specify the page directive. Say at page within double quotes /edit/. Now this URL segment will be the ID of the book we are editing. So for this, we need to use what is known as a route parameter. So use curly braces and within that specify a route parameter called ID, and let's constrain the route parameter to be an integer. So say :int. Remove the heading. Use the page title component and set the content to edit book. Let's go to the code block now. The value of the route parameter in the URL can be retrieved by defining a public property with a similar name and decorating it with a parameter attribute. So let's define a public property of type int called ID. Casing does not matter, so we can make I uppercase and decorate it with the parameter attribute. Now once we have the ID of a particular book, we'd like to get information about that book. So let's define a public property of type book, make it nullable and call it book. And when we update this book, the data for this book will come from the form that we'll create in just a bit. So let's decorate this property with supply parameter from form attribute. Also, let's inject iBook repository. So at the top here, say @inject iBook repository. Once the edit page is initialized, we want to use a repository to get the information about that book so that it can be displayed on a form. So override the onInitialized async lifecycle method, and inside that say book and use a null coalescing assignment operator ? Equals await repository dot get by id async id. And now let's add the required razor markup for the form. Say if book is not null. We can reuse a markup from the add new component. So go to the add new component, copy this entire div and go to the edit component and paste it here. Let's make some changes. Set the form name of this edit form component to edit book form, and for the onValidSubmit parameter, set the value to edit book. We'll create this method in just a bit. Replace the heading text with edit book and use a razor expression to evaluate the ID of the book. Since this is an edit scenario, let's use a hidden input field to store book ID. So say input type equals hidden, name equals book.id, value equals @book.id. Now let's define the edit book method. So go to the code block and say private async task edit book, and inside that say if book is not null, await repository.update async book. Now once we update the book, we need to redirect the user to the list page. So at the top here say @inject navigation manager navigation, and go back to the edit method and say navigation.navigate to /. Now let's run the app. First let's add a dummy book so that we can test editing it. Book title 123, book author 123, enter some publication date and set the category to science and click submit. So here we see we got the book with the title book title 123 added. Let's try editing it. Click on the edit button, update the title to book title 456 and the author as well to book author 456 and set the category to travel and click submit. And here we see we got the title and author updated, and if we click on the edit button we see we have the category set to travel as well. In the next video we'll learn how to create a reusable form component for adding and updating data in a Blazor web app in .NET 8. In this video, we'll learn how to create a reusable form component for adding and updating data in a Blazor web application in .NET 8. In the simple book catalog project, let's open add-new.razor. Here we have used the edit form component to accept input data. And also if you open the edit component, here again we have used the edit form component with a few changes applied to it. Since there is some duplicated razor markup, let's create a reusable form component that encapsulates edit form. Right-click the components folder and select Add Razor Component and name the component Book Form. Let's get rid of the heading. Now let's go to the code block. First we need to identify whether we are adding a new book or updating an existing book. So let's define a public property of type bool called isEditMode and initialize it to false. So this means that by default we are adding a new book. Decorate the property with a parameter attribute. Then let's define a property of type int called bookID and decorate it with a parameter attribute. And a nullable property of type book, call it book. And since we want this property to be supplied from form data, let's decorate this property with supply parameter from form attribute. And let's define an expression body for a member called title that will be used to set the form's title. So when we are in edit mode, we need to set the form title to edit book along with the book ID. So let's use string interpolation here. Say $ within double quotes, edit book within curly braces, book ID. If you are not in edit mode, let's set the title to add new book. Now, when the component is initialized, we'd like to talk to the book repository to populate the book property. So let's inject iBook repository, call it repository, and let's override onInitialized async lifecycle method. And inside that, we can check if is edit mode, book null coalescing assignment operator question mark equals await repository.getById async, pass in book ID. Else book null coalescing assignment operator new. So this means that if we are not in edit mode, we're simply instantiating a new book. Now let's add the required razor markup for our form. So at the top here, say @if book is not null. Now we would like to use the edit form component. So go to the edit page and copy this edit form component and come back to the book form component and paste it here. Let's set the form name to add or edit book form. And let's set the onValidSubmit parameter value to add or edit book. And for the heading, let's use a razor expression to evaluate the title member that we created earlier. And we want to have the hidden input field only if we are in edit mode. So let's say @if is edit mode and put the hidden input field inside this block. Let's now define the add or edit book method. So let's scroll down and say private async task add or edit book. Now this method will be called when the form is submitted. Now from the book form component, we would like to inform the parent component that the form has been submitted. So over here at the top, let's define a public property of type event callback of book and call it onValidBookSubmit and declare the property with the parameter attribute. And inside the add or edit book method, let's invoke that event callback by saying await onValidBookSubmit.invokeAsync and pass in the book. Now we are done with the book form component. Let's go to the add new page and remove the edit form component and replace it with the book form component. Set isEditMode equals false and set onValidBookSubmit equals add book. And in the code block, we don't need this book property anymore. And let's have the addBook method accept a parameter of type book and pass that book argument to the addAsync method. Now let's work on the edit page. Let's replace this edit form component with book form component. Set isEditMode to true and set bookID to @ID. And finally, set the onValidBookSubmit parameter to edit book. And we don't need this if block, so let's remove it. Let's go to the code block and remove the book parameter and the onInitializeAsync lifecycle method. And for the edit book method, let's add a parameter of type book. And within the method, let's remove the if condition. And finally, pass the book argument to the updateAsync method. With all these changes in place, let's run the app to see if the application works just fine. Add a new book with title, new book title 123, and author, new book author 123. Enter some publication date and set the category to fitness. Now let's try editing that book. Click on the edit button. Change the book title to new book title 456 and the book author to new book author 456. Change the publication date and also change the category to travel. We can see the changed book title and author name. And if we click on the edit button, we can see the changes in our publication date and category as well. In the next video, we'll learn how to delete data from a database using Entity Framework Core in a Blazor web app in .NET 8. In this video, we'll learn how to delete data from a database using Entity Framework Core in a Blazor web app in .NET 8. Let's add a method to the iBook repository interface for performing the delete operation. So let's say task delete by ID async int ID. Now let's implement that method in the infrastructure project. So open simplebookcatalog.infrastructure and expand repositories and double click the book repository class. Let's implement the interface. First we would like to get the book by ID. So say var book equals await get by ID async and pass in ID. Now check if book is not null, in which case we say context.books.remove book await context.save changes async. Now let's work on the presentation layer. Open Simple Book Catalog project and expand components folder and double click bookcard.razor. We would like to add a button to delete a book. So after the edit link, define a button element with the text delete. Now when the button is clicked, we want to show a dialog to confirm deleting a book. So let's set the onClick razor directive attribute to open confirm dialog and set the class to btn, btn danger, shadow none, and ms3. Now let's define the open confirm dialog method in the code block below. So say private void open confirm dialog Now let's create a private boolean field for showing the dialog. So say private bool show confirm dialog, and within the open confirm dialog method, set show confirm dialog equals true. Now let's create a reusable Razor component for the delete confirmation dialog. So in Solution Explorer, right-click the Components folder and select Add Razor Component and name the component Delete Confirm Dialog and click Add. Let's define a boolean parameter for this component to show the dialog. Next, in Razor markup, let's use Razor syntax to check if show is true. Then display a div element with class confirm dialog container. Inside that, let's create another div with a class confirm dialog and create a h3 heading with the text are you sure? And after the heading, create a div with a class deflex flexrow justify content end and empty3. And inside this div, let's create a button with the text cancel. Set onClick Razor Directive attribute to onCancel, which we will create in just a bit, and set the class attribute to btn secondary, shadow none. And then create a button with the text delete and set the onClick Razor Directive attribute to onOK and set the class attribute to btn danger, shadow none and ms3. Now I would like to inform the parent component when the cancel and delete buttons have been clicked. So let's go to the code block and define a public property of type event callback. Call it onCancel and decorate it with a parameter attribute. Similarly, define another property of type event callback called onOK and decorate it with a parameter attribute. Now let's style this component. Right-click the components folder and select add new item. Search for CSS. Choose style sheet and name the component delete confirm dialog.razor.css and click add. Now we want to style the confirm dialog container and confirm dialog divs. So use a class selector, say dot confirm dialog container within curly braces, set the position to absolute, top to 0, right to 0, bottom to 0, left to 0, set the min height to 100 VH, set display to flex, flex direction to column, set align items to center and background color to RGBA 0.5 and finally set Z index to 2000. Similarly, let's style the confirm dialog div. Say dot confirm dialog within curly braces, display flex direction column, justify content space between, set min width to 20 rem, padding to 2 rem, border radius to 1 rem, background color white, margin top 1.5 rem, and finally let's set position to fixed. Now let's use the delete confirm dialog component inside bookcard.razor. Set the show parameter to show confirm dialog and set the onCancel parameter to cancel delete, which we will create in just a bit. Likewise, set the onOK parameter to delete book. Let's create the cancel delete method. Go to the code block and say private void cancel delete. And inside this method, let's set show confirm dialog equals false. So this will effectively close the delete confirm dialog. And below, let's create another method, say private async task delete book. To delete the book, we can use the book repository. So let's go to the top and inject iBook repository and call it repository. And also we want to navigate to the root URL. So let's inject navigation manager, call it navigation. Now go to the code block and inside the delete book method, say await repository .delete by id async, pass in book.id. Next, set show confirm dialog equals false, and finally say navigation.navigate to, pass in a slash. Let's run the app and try deleting a book. We see the delete confirmation dialog does not show up. This is because our application is using static server rendering by default, and our book cart component is rendered on the server, and there is no interactivity for the book cart component either on the server or on the client. So that's why when the delete button on the book cart component is clicked, nothing happens. Now we can make the book cart component interactive by going to list.razor and applying a render mode at the page level. So at the top say @render mode interactive server. So this makes the entire page interactive using interactive server rendering via the Blazor server hosting model. So all the components on the page, including the book cart component, will be made interactive. Now alternatively, we can apply a render mode at the component level by setting the @render mode razor directive attribute to interactive server. Now let's try running the app. Let's click the delete button. We see the confirmation dialog shows up, and if we click the cancel button, the dialog closes. Let's click delete once again and click the delete button. We see the book gets removed from the app. Now one last thing, we can make the delete confirm dialog more generic by declaring a nullable property of type render fragment and call it child content and decorating that property with the parameter attribute. Now in the razor markup here at the top, instead of the heading, we can render child content using razor syntax. Now we can rename the delete confirm dialog.razor component to simply confirm dialog. Now let's go to the book cart component and rename delete confirm dialog to simply confirm dialog. And instead of a self-closing tag, let's use opening and closing tags. And as a child content, define a h3 heading with the text, do you want to delete book at book.id. This way, the consumer of the confirm dialog component is free to set the message text. Now let's run the app and try deleting a book once again. We see the new message pops up. Let's click the delete button. We see the book got removed from the app. Hi everyone, and thanks for taking my course Blazor CRUD Jumpstart with Entity Framework Core in .NET 8. In this course, we learned how to perform CRUD operations using Entity Framework Core in a Blazor web app in .NET 8. Along the way, we learned some of the important features of Blazor in .NET 8, such as enhanced navigation and form handling and streaming rendering. So I hope you found the course informative and helpful, and thank you once again for your time.